Welcome to the Zen of Reffing Roller Derby, Lesson 28, Passing the Star. I'm Axis of Stevel, the author of the training manual. I'm filming this on August 3rd, 2018. The content of this presentation is up to date as of this recording. Should this video become outdated or replaced by a newer version, I'll put a link on the screen to where you can find more information. And as always, you can find the latest version of the full training manual at www.tinyurl.com/zenreffing. A quick disclaimer: the WFTDA, MRDA, and JRDA are not responsible for the content of the training manual or this presentation, nor do they make any claims as to the accuracy of their content. Another note: if you spot any errors or outdated information in this presentation, please put a comment on YouTube explaining the issue and listing the time code. Lesson 28, Passing the Star. As an old mentor of mine once told me, more referee tears have been shed from star passes than any other area of the rule set. The reason for this is that when there is officiating error in relationship to a star pass, it can cause a cascading series of errors that can basically absolutely mangle a jam in progress. I'll explain more on that in a little bit. But for now, it's enough to know you really want to know how to get star passes right in a game. Now, let's start with some basic concepts. A star pass is the legal transfer of both the star, meaning the jammer helmet cover, and the position of jammer from the jammer to the pivot. Now, I don't have a star cover handy. I'm a referee. I don't do star covers. But I do have my cell phone here, my iPhone. So this is going to be my star. So I'm going to use this throughout the video here to demonstrate star passes. Now, in a star pass, lead jammer status is not transferred. The jammer status is. The pivot basically becomes the jammer, but if the initial jammer was lead, that's lost. The lead status is not transferred. Furthermore, if you do a star pass before lead has been declared, the new jammer becomes ineligible to become lead. Even if they get all the requirements after that to become lead jammer, they still don't get it. That star pass has invalidated their ability to become lead. Now, the jammer who initiates the star pass, well, obviously, once they're not the jammer anymore, they have to be something, so they become a blocker. They do not become a pivot, because there is no pivot in that jam for that team after a legal star pass takes place. This is why a star pass cannot be reversed. You cannot do a star pass, jammer hands it to the pivot now becomes the new jammer, decides, oh, actually, I don't want that after all, and can't hand it back. That's actually a penalty. The reason being is now they're handing it to a blocker. And blockers cannot be engaged, cannot take part of a star pass. Now, the team's pivot cover is considered debris after that, after a legal star pass, and may be hidden, may be removed from the track area, even be, sometimes it gets dumped on the track as a result of the star pass. That's fine. It's just debris. It doesn't even matter if the other team picks it up. It can be safely removed from the track area. It's not used in the game. If the star pass is legal. Now, star passes are not always actually legal. Sometimes you can have what's known as an incomplete star pass or an illegal star pass. Those are star passes gone wrong, and we'll talk a little more about those in a minute. Now, what you need to know is that credit for earned passes on opposing jammer are transferred to the new jammer. What I mean is this. I'm jammer. I got my hat on here. I go past two black blockers, then I pass it the star to the pivot. I should say, by the way, I'm wearing it on my head when I go past those two black blockers. So I've earned basically 2 points. Then I pass it to the pivot. Pivot becomes the jammer. Pivot then continues on. Let's say they don't earn any more legal passes, but they end the scoring trip. We still get that 2 points because those 2 points were earned legally because I had the star on my own head when I went past them. So credit basically for earned passes still granted over there. If the star pass occurs, if the jammer falls back into a prior trip, the new jammer I should say, then the new jammer begins on the same trip. It takes a little explanation. Suppose I'm, let's suppose I'm lead jammer. I exit the engagement zone. I got the star on my head here. I fall. And I get sucked back into the pack. So now I have returned to the prior trip through the pack. I get up. I'm trying to get through. I can't get through. So I pass the star to the pivot. Okay, that's fine, but the pivot counts as on the prior trip through the pack. Basically, as I've said in previous lessons on scoring and some other things, that a jammer is either on the current trip through the pack or the prior trip from the pack. The star pass is considered to take place on the same. Now, it can happen on occasion that a pivot, is in the pack, and the jammer basically goes all the way clockwise back around, enters through the front of the engagement zone, and then conducts the star pass. So don't try to think in terms of, well, this person's a lap ahead of this person. You're just going to give yourself a headache if you do that. It's enough to know when you do that the new blocker is considered to be a member of the pack. They got to stay with the pack. The new jammer is considered to be a trip down. Basically, if the star pass is conducted when the jammer's a trip down, then the new jammer is a trip down. If the star pass is conducted when the jammer's on the current lap, then the new jammer is on the current lap. It stays the same. Let's see. Star passes. Yes, they are judged for legality when the jammer releases the star into the pivot's grasp. Now, a good little aside here is, what is the legal star pass process? Well, jammer takes the helmet cover. They've got it in their hand now. They hand their helmet cover to the pivot. Once they're both grasping the helmet cover, the jammer releases it. It's in that instant that the jammer releases it that we judge the star pass for legality. And we'll talk what those tests are for legality. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So in the instant they release, that pivot in front now becomes the jammer. And the old jammer now becomes a blocker. So basically, pivot turn jammer and jammer turn blocker at that point. And that new jammer, like I'd said, resumes that scoring trip or trip to the pack, whatever trip to the pack that was, at exactly that same point that the star pass occurred. Star passes may only be prevented by legal blocking. We're going to talk more on this in a little while, but basically, if you want to interrupt a star pass, you cannot reach out with your hand and bat the other person's arm away. Your hand is not in a legal blocking zone. You may not initiate blocks with your arm like that. So you can't push it away. That's not allowed. That would be a penalty if you're preventing the star pass from going through by doing it. Finally, fallen star covers may only be retrieved by the pivot or jammer. It happens a lot of the time in a star pass. Something goes wrong. The jammer gets blocked. They drop the cover. It lands on the floor. Blocker may not pick it up. Only the pivot or jammer from that team may pick it up. Now let's talk about incomplete star passes. Now, an incomplete star pass is a violation of the star pass procedure, meaning something that, what I said in the legal star pass, that you're supposed to hand it there, something went wrong in this, but it's not a penalty violation of it. It wasn't a major violation. For example, the jammer throws the cover, to the pivot. You can throw it, but in that case, you're not both grasping at the same time, and the jammer is releasing it. So if you throw it, that's just simply you've given the cover to the pivot, but you did not give the position of jammer to the pivot. You've just got a pivot holding the jammer cover, which is entirely legal. It's maybe not in the team's strategic interest to do it, but maybe there is something they're doing. I have heard of games where the jammer throws the cover to the pivot, which confuses the other team, and their wall breaks, basically, because they're not sure where to guard at that point. And the jammer races past, numerous opposing skaters, and the pivot throws it back to the jammer, and the jammer exits the engagement zone. Entirely legal. You risk the cover getting, hit in the air by, a blocker kind of putting their body in the way, but, that's so be it. Another way, jammer drops the cover, pivot grabs it in the air. Again, not a legal star pass. That is an incomplete star pass. The pivot retrieves the fallen star cover from the track. The pivot is handed the star from a blocker or opposing skater. Now, normally, of course, the blocker or opposing skater aren't going to have it, but on occasion, they will. Like I'm skating along and, oh my goodness, I've got the opposing star stuck to the Velcro on my elbow pad. Pull it off. That's fine. If I hand it back to the pivot, the pivot, it's like, that's not a penalty. That's, or if I drop it and the pivot picks it up, that's fine. Even if an opposing skater is like, oh crap, and they just hand it to the pivot back on the original team, or the jammer on the original team, that's fine. We're not going to penalize for that. That's just good sportsmanship that they're giving it back at that point. They could drop it. So, finally, to complete a legal star pass, the jammer need only re-grasp the cover at the same time the pivot is grasping it, then let go. I'll explain. Incomplete star pass. You've now got the pivot holding the cover. So the pivot holds it out, jammer grasps it. Remember, this is one of the steps that required in a star pass, and jammer releases it. That's a legal star pass. Pivot is now the jammer. So most of the time, in my experience, If the pivot is trying to hand it back to the jammer is going to just take it. The pivot will let go. They don't have to. It's enough to go like that. All they have to do is just grasp on it just for a moment, long enough for me to see that they have gained control over that cover, or at least partial control since they're both holding it. That's fine. And then as soon as the jammer lets go, that's a legal star pass at that point. So what is an illegal star pass? Well, an illegal star pass is the penalty violation of the passing procedure. So again, like incomplete star pass, the star is transferred, but not the position of jammer. And the initiator of the star pass, who's almost always the jammer, but not quite always, and we'll talk about that in a little while, is issued the penalty. For example, handing the star when the jammer is out of bounds, down, outside the engagement zone, or on their way to the penalty box. Basically, you want a star pass to be able to be prevented by legal blocking. Well, if the jammer's out of play, or the jammer's down, you can't block the jammer if they're down and they reach and they hand the cover. You can't block the jammer if they're out of bounds and they want to hand the cover, or if they're, on their way to the penalty box. Well, on their way to the penalty box is because they're not supposed to be doing anything but going to the penalty box. It's at that point, if they do a cover, it's essentially an insubordination because they are engaging in another action rather than go to the penalty box. So, but either way, you could call it star pass violation. It works fine. As an old mentor of mine said, sometimes you just need to call someone on a penalty. You can worry about later what technically it should have been called, but the penalty needed to get issued. Another type of illegal star pass is handing the star to a pivot, but the pivot is out of bounds, down, outside the engagement zone, in the penalty box queue, on their way to the penalty box, or not wearing the stripe. Now, most of this is going to be pretty obvious. Down, out of bounds, outside the engagement zone. You can't block somebody who's in those places. On their way to the penalty box. Again, they're supposed to be leaving the track. They're not supposed to be accepting a star pass. If they're not wearing the stripe, well, if that stripe is off their head, they're not the pivot. They're just a blocker until they get that back on their head. There is no such thing as like an inactive pivot. Either you're a pivot wearing the cover, or you're just a blocker whose sole perk is that you can regain the pivot abilities if you put it back on your head. But certainly you cannot, accept that jammer helmet cover while you're not wearing the stripe. And then finally, on the being in the penalty box queue, pivot goes to the box. Box is full. Box waves the person off. They return to the track. The trouble is, if you do a star pass now, that person's now the jammer. So then if they go back to the box when they're resent back there, well, but they're supposed to serve the original penalty as a pivot, but they're now the jammer. So what are we going to have them serve as? If we have them serve as pivot, well, then who's the jammer right now? It's just a big mess. We don't allow that to go. Finally, handing the star to a blocker. This happens sometimes. Sometimes it's because the jammer's kind of like holding up the cover and a blocker takes it and the jammer just lets go. The jammer's not thinking at that point. Can't hand the star to a blocker. So in that case, if the jammer is trying to initiate the star pass and they release it to blocker, penalty goes to the blocker. Or I'm sorry, penalty goes to the jammer. Penalty goes to the initiator of the star pass. That's usually the jammer. We'll talk in just a moment about cases where it's not. Other actions now related to helmet covers. Now, penalty level actions would include a blocker retrieving a fallen jammer star cover off the floor. Can't do it. The helmet covers are like kryptonite to blockers. They shouldn't touch it. It's really bad for them. Not good. They get penalties if they touch it. They don't want it. The exception being obviously if it's stuck in their gear, we'll allow them to take it off and drop it. That's fine. But they may not just pick it up off the floor. That's a penalty. Also, wresting control of the star from the jammer's hand. Jammer's holding it out, and the blocker suddenly runs by, grabs it, and yanks it out of their hand. The jammer's not trying to release it. And sometimes you can even see that cover stretching. Excuse me, it's stretching as that blocker's not letting go and they're trying to get it, and finally it just springs out of the jammer's hand. Well, this was not the jammer initiating a star pass to the blocker. This was the blocker seizing the star pass from the jammer. That's different. At that point, we're going to issue the star pass violation to the blocker, because we're basically saying the blocker was forcing the star pass in this case. It was not the jammer's doing. So you have to make a bit of a judgment call in there. If you think the jammer is handing it, giving to the pivot, and letting it go, that's a penalty to the jammer. If you think the jammer is holding out and pivot steals it from the jammer, I'm sorry, a blocker steals it from the jammer, that's a penalty then to the blocker. Some actions where a pivot can get a penalty would include donning the helmet cover received via an incomplete star pass. Remember, incomplete star passes are pretty obvious. Those are ones where the cover is picked up off the floor. The cover is, thrown to the pivot, where the cover is dropped and the pivot grabs it. Generally, the pivot should know that this was not a legal star pass. So they may not put it on their head, but if they do after an incomplete star pass and they put it on their head, that's a penalty. Essentially, they have usurped the position of jammer at that point, and we're not going to give it to them. They don't get to become the jammer, and they get a penalty for it. So we allow a pivot to hold the jammer cover. We do not allow a pivot to basically suddenly try to pretend they're the jammer. Even if they think they legally can, that doesn't matter. They had a reasonable way of knowing that they were not the jammer. Put it on their head, that's a penalty. Following an illegal star pass. Now, remember, an illegal star pass might be just the jammer having their foot 1 inch out of bounds, and the pivot has a legitimate reason to think they are the jammer. So you hand it, they hand this to the pivot, boom, jammer's called on a penalty, but the pivot's already racing out of there. Now, this is where the cascading series of errors that I mentioned could get out of control, because that pivot needs to be redirected back, needs to be told that, you are still the pivot, and then if they go out of the engagement zone, out of play. Now, this can confuse the pivot a little at first, because they're suddenly like thinking, but I am the jammer, I just got it. Maybe they didn't hear that star pass violation penalty. And it can take a little bit to communicate to them, so you need to give them the opportunity to learn that they are, in fact, still the pivot. That being said, sometimes it just happens that, the instant they get the cover, they're springing forward, they're throwing it on their head. We're not going to penalize that they put it on their head right away. We've already given a penalty to the jammer for the star pass violation, so we're going to accept, okay, this person needs a moment to re-understand that they are not, the jammer. They had no way of knowing that foot was 1 inch out of bounds. So again, you warn them. You are the jammer. You are the jammer. You can instruct them. Blue 273. You are the jammer. Remove your helmet cover. And they have to remove the star. If finally they just don't, then you can issue a penalty for that. An illegal procedure penalty. You could call it star pass violation if you want to. It doesn't really matter what you're calling it at that point. Illegal procedure. Impersonating the jammer. Illegal procedure. Wearing the jammer helmet cover. You can kind of phrase that however you want to. The important thing is to get the penalty issued. At what point do you actually say the person is, or what point do you issue the penalty after giving warnings? How many warnings do you issue? That's a good question. It's contextually based. I would take into account the level of the game. Like a sanctioned game, I would be more strict than at more like a regulation game. At a very high level game, I would expect the skaters to have a better rules knowledge and a better mastery of the game than I would expect at Nowhere Roller Derby. That's a non-WIFTA league, which is doing a very casual intra-league game. That's fine. I'm willing to give them a little more leeway in here. There's no set number of warnings, or no set how you need to give a warning or what before you issue that penalty. So it might feel like it's inconsistent across leagues, but I think I'm trying to take into account the level of game I'm at. So, because my goal is not to be such a stickler for the rules that I can get people with technical, violations like this. But I'm going to give that skater every reasonable opportunity to learn that they are not the jammer, and if they're still wearing the cover, I'm going to issue the penalty. How much leeway is just going to depend on the level of the game. Another penalty for the pivot. Retrieving the star after an incomplete star pass while not wearing the stripe. Remember what I said, pivot has to be wearing the stripe in order to take possession of that helmet cover. That's their armor against the kryptonite, if you will. So if that pivot is for some reason not wearing the stripe, they've got it in their hand, and then they pick up a fallen star, star cover with their other hand, boom, that's the penalty. Can't do that. You have to be wearing the stripe. That's a pretty rare one, but it's important. Now, a penalty that can land either the pivot or the jammer in trouble would be completely hiding the star cover. This could be in one's jersey, down their shorts, even wadded up in their hand. It can particularly happen like black helmet covers can be very difficult to see if you wad, kind of get your hand around it. So in that particular case, yeah, if you completely hide the cover, and I view it as the other team is no longer able to see that cover, and a tiny little 1 inch tuft sticking out is probably not going to be enough. If the person has really hidden that cover, boom, that's a penalty. Illegal procedure, hiding the cover, or you could call it star pass violation, whatever you want to call it, like that. Basically, they've hidden the cover. Now, if they have a partially hidden cover, meaning like it's sticking out a little bit and I can kind of see it, but it's not very clear, then you can tell them, Blue 217, show the star. That's the warning. Show the star. Basically, reveal the star. They don't have to sit there and wave it for the other team to kind of see, but at the same time, the other team has a right to kind of know who the jammer is, or at least have a good shot at knowing who the jammer is at any given point. And to that end, that's why they can't wad it up in their hands. So if they're kind of wadding it up and it's just showing a little bit, I'm going to tell them to show the star. Make it a little more obvious. If nothing else, as a jammer referee, or even as just any other position referee, I want to know who the jammer is. So I don't appreciate when they're hiding the cover, because again, this can lead to the cascading series of errors when the referee crew now has no idea who the jammer is or where the cover went. That is problematic. Now, another penalty you can come into contact with is an illegal procedure penalty they call pass interference. Now, pass interference, these are penalties now that go to the opposing team. So this would include things like disrupting an opponent's star pass by using an illegal blocking zone. I talked about this before. You're holding out the star cover, and the other I keep accidentally trying to call 911 every time I'm doing that. And then you reach out with your forearm and you push the person's hand to prevent the star pass. Now, you have to use some discretion here, because there's a lot of difference between the jammer and the pivot are 6 feet apart and somebody gives a little push, versus their hands are 6 inches apart and you give a push to stop it. So basically, if they're 6 feet apart and that jammer's holding it out, I wouldn't really consider that to be disrupting a star pass. It's like making an opponent stumble, but they don't really severely off balance. They're not falling out of bounds, they're not falling down, but they're kind of giving a little stumble. It's just not enough to warrant a penalty. But if you have disrupted the opponent's star pass when they're very close to completing it, then yeah, that's significant impact on the game. Similarly, you can get a pass interference penalty by disrupting an opponent's star pass by contacting an illegal target zone. This one would be rarer because, generally speaking, they're trying to pass the star forward. So if you back block the skater, you're likely to send them towards the opposing, or towards their pivot so they can complete it. So that's not likely to do it. Maybe some sort of leg block or something in there would do it, or some sort of low block or something. Generally not a high block, just because, any sort of forceful contact to the head is going to, net a penalty there. Disrupting an opponent's star pass via illegal contact. Now, most notably in this, you're going to find clockwise blocks or stop blocks. And these are actually fairly common. This can happen with, that star pass is so close to being done that an opposing skater suddenly chums in, just goes clockwise into the jammer, pushing them back now so the star pass cannot be completed. That's a penalty. Similarly, a stop block, basically doing something like this. They're stopped. They're trying to stop them. They stop, and they stop too much, and they do that. At that point, though, it's almost not even the metric that you're issuing the penalty for preventing the star pass, because they've stopped the opponent from going forward anymore, and they're maintaining that, and that's a stop block whether or not they're doing a star pass. So, finally, controlling an opposing team's helmet cover. And whether you want to call this pass interference or just illegal procedure controlling the helmet cover, I don't know, something. It doesn't really matter how you want to call it as long as you get it called. This is basically if, the opponent's helmet cover is on the ground and you stand on it. Not to say you accidentally step on it or accidentally skate over it, but you actually stand on it and stand there, with your foot down on that position. You're holding it. You have taken control of their cover. If you kick it, like that, and it doesn't even necessarily kick it while somebody's reaching for it, but you just deliberately go and kick it. Again, use your discretion here, because sometimes skaters will accidentally go into it, or they're blocked into it or something, and they fall on it. I'm not going to issue a penalty for that. But if they have intentionally taken control of it, this sometimes can happen, like, we talked about, oh dear, it's hanging from my elbow pad, so I pull off the star, and at that point, I'm now holding the opponent's helmet cover. So what I do is, at this point, is going to decide whether I get a penalty or not, so I drop it. That's fine. So I hand it back to their pivot or their jammer. That's fine. So I skate away with it. Okay, now that's a problem, because now I'm leaving the scene of the crime now, holding their helmet cover. The scene of the crime being where I discovered and pulled it off my elbow pad. But if I skate off with it still holding it, that's a penalty. Now, there are some rare expulsion level actions. These would be gross misconduct you can get in here. Number one, removing the star from an opposing jammer's head. this I've never heard or seen in a game, but I presume it's happened at some point. But yeah, jammers skating along, and they got the helmet cover on their head. Opponent, doesn't matter what, whether they're blocker, pivot, or jammer, opponent reaches out and just pulls that cover right off their head. You can't do that. That is incredibly dangerous. I would expel a skater even if there was a problem in the jam and maybe two people somehow wound up wearing jammer covers from the same team. It doesn't matter. You do not reach out and yank a cover off the opponent's head. You're going to pull their neck. You can severely injure them. Now, that's an expulsion level action immediately right there. You never do that. There's some leeway if you're doing this into a teammate, particularly at like game start, at jam start, when you're like, blue team, you have two pivots, or blue 2 1 3, move your cover, something, and the person reaches out and just lightly pulls it off their teammate. Again, that's a lot different than now you're skating at speed and you reach out and you're trying to yank that off off a teammate. That's a lot different there. Also, if suppose you've got the opposing star, I don't know, maybe whoops, it's on my gear, I pull it off, and instead of dropping it, I throw it out into the audience. Well, I've now involved the audience of the game because potentially that jammer is going to go running out into the audience trying to go retrieve it. The audience really doesn't want to go be where the skaters are now charging out trying to do things in the game. So, no. Similarly, I would not, I would expel a skater if they threw it back into the bench area, if they threw it to the announcers, etc. Absolutely not. Like that. We do not want to. These are not legitimate areas of the game for the gameplay to take place. Also, now you've got the problem if you throw it in the bench area, well, the people in the bench area are going to throw it back out there. So now they're tossing it out to the jammer. Now we got people not even involved in the jam that are sitting there doing this. No. We don't want this. This is a really, really, really bad area for the game to go into. So now, use some discretion here as well. If a person takes it and they throw it 2 feet down, I'll treat it like they're dropping it. That's fine. Particularly if they're near the track line, they just want to throw it right over the edge of the track line. Fine. I don't care. That's, I'm going to let it go. If they take it and they throw it 10 feet, say to the outside of the outside safety lane, I may issue a penalty for that as well, because they have remained in control of the opponent's helmet cover and they threw it, but it wasn't really an expulsion level action. It's not like they threw it into the audience or the bench area or over a wall or something like that. So, no, it's not that. So, maybe they were legitimately trying to do it thinking, well, I didn't want someone to trip on it. That's fine, but our skaters are trained to deal with obstacles on the track, and they can step and they can skate around things, and they're supposed to be, kind of watching where they're going. So, we understand this stuff. So they don't have to throw it to the outside safety lane. But if they do, and they throw it 10 feet, I'm going to issue a penalty. If it's 2 feet, I don't care. If they throw it in the audience, they get expelled. Finally, an example of legal play would be this, take the pivot cover. Sometimes it happens, you pass the star, to the pivot, it's a legal star pass, pivot now becomes the jammer, and in trying to put the star cover on, the pivot cover pops off and lands on the ground. Like I said earlier, that's debris. So if even someone from the other team stops and just picks that up and throws it outside, that's fine. I don't consider that any different than, a beer can rolls onto the track or something and somebody throws that out of the way. It's throwing debris. What? You've got somebody's toe stop fell off, somebody's worried somebody's going to slip, boom, they toss it to the outside of the edge of the safety. Fine. I'm not going to penalize skaters for throwing debris off the track in that respect. Now, some additional rules and procedures here. Number 1, the star pass complete hand signal. There we go. Use the star pass complete hand signal following a legal star pass. I encourage all referees who witness the star pass to do this. I encourage all NSOs who witness this to do this as well. It's very, very useful to do that star pass complete hand signal over there, just because it lets the announcers, the audience, the teams, the benches, everybody knows there was a star pass. This is a good thing. We want this sort of thing communicated. Another thing. Star pass removes superior position for purposes of cutting the track for both participants. So, let's say person blocks a jammer out of bounds. Let's say jammer blocks another jammer out of bounds. The inbounds jammer then does a star pass. Well, in doing so, remember that jammer has become the blocker and blah blah blah. It's like they erase all superior position for both the jammer and the pivot in that star pass. So the out of bounds jammer can return right back in front of that, that jammer turn blocker. Now, they might get a no-earn pass in doing that, but that's fine. They're able to return, in front of them. That's fine. So, another thing, star pass removes superior position for purposes of cutting the track for both participants. So, Let's see. Ah, yes. If during a star pass, if the helmet cover is handed past opposing blockers, they do not count as earned passes. So it's pretty self-explanatory. I come in, I got the star pass, I pass 2 black blockers, take my star off, hand it over the shoulders of the other 2 black blockers, pivot takes it, pivot goes off. Well, I never skated upright, inbounds, etc. past those 2. I passed the star over their shoulders. That's fine. I don't get the points for those final 2. So when the new pivot turns jammer, exits the engagement zone, we get 2 points. The other 2 were not gained because of the star pass. Similarly, the legal star pass occurs at jam start, and jam start, and I pass the star across all opposing blockers. Matter of fact, I'm going to even say across every blocker. I boom, pass 7 of them, because of the 8th, of course, being the pivot who's receiving it. So boom, it's like over the 7 of them, and the pivot just races. I'm sorry, now jammer, pivot turn jammer, now races out of the engagement zone. They have just completed their initial trip through the pack, even though they technically did not go through the pack. That doesn't matter. They've gotten out of the engagement zone from the front. They're now on their first scoring trip. There are some referees who get confused by this, and they say, but they didn't legally pass a blocker, so this somehow doesn't count as their initial trip through the pack. That's a red herring. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the new jammer never earned a pass on any opposing blockers, or, blockers from the same team for that matter. Doesn't matter. I could design a scenario for you where instead of a star pass, a jammer literally gets no earned pass on everyone in the pack. And then they get out of the engagement zone. Well, of course, they don't get a lead, but they've completed their initial trip through the pack. That's fine. Finally, pivots may legally throw the star into or out of the penalty box. Consider this. Pivots sometimes, there's a star pass, it's an incomplete star pass, but before the pivot can hand it back, the pivot gets a penalty. Pivot gets confused, skates to the blocks with the star cover and sits down. Now you got a problem, because you got the jammer who wants their cover back, but technically the jammer's not really supposed to go skate into the penalty box to get that cover back, and then leave. So in that particular case, that's fine. Pivot, you can throw the cover out. You can throw it back out onto the track. That's fine. You can throw it into the safety lane. That's fine. If for some reason the jammer is in the box and the pivot is on the track holding it, they can throw the cover into the box. Pivot can lean down and pick it up. That's fine. Like that. As long as it's basically a pivot returning the star to the jammer, no advantage is being gained. We're just returning the game to its natural state. So we're okay with the star going into or out of the penalty box. It's even if the pivot and jammer are both sitting there in the penalty box, and the pivot is like, hey, I got your star, here's your star, and they hand it back to the jammer. That's fine. Now, the moment the jammer tries to give it back to the pivot, yeah, we're gonna give them a star pass violation for that. But just giving it back to the jammer, totally fine. We'll allow that. Few more things. First, runaway pivots. It happens sometimes following an illegal star pass or an incomplete star pass that the pivot is now holding the jammer cover, and they think they're the jammer, and they are just racing for the front of the engagement zone and out, and now starting to go around the track. This is the responsibility of both the IPRs and the OPRs to solve, usually the IPR, in particular the front IPR, because that person is probably booking as fast as they can. So, if they're stuck in the pack and the OPRs can help, great. Otherwise, if they're out of the pack and they are just starting to book around the track, the front IPR is the only one who's really going to be able to get them. So the front IPR, basically go after them there. Cut around the apex a little bit, immediately, blue 2-7, you are the pivot, out of play. You're doing two things. First, you're reinforcing or you're reassessing to them, you're communicating what position they are. You're not coaching by telling them you are the pivot. You can even, if you want to be particularly nice, you could say, you are the pivot, you are not a jammer out of the play. That's fine too. But you're communicating with them. The out of play is you've now given the warning to them that they need to turn back. Because remember, if this pivot goes all the way around the track and they re-enter the pack from the back, even if they figure out towards the end of this that they are not actually the pivot, that they're not the jammer, they're actually a pivot, but they continue going in, we no longer have an illegal return penalty. That's gone from the rule set. That was in prior sets. We don't have it now. Why do we not have it now? Because it shouldn't be necessary. That person took a complete lap. You should be able to get that pretty fast by saying, out of play. If they continue going, all right, Bluetooth 7, failure to return, and you issue the penalty to them. By the way, another tip. When assessing a penalty to anyone involved in a star pass or its confusing aftermath, specify the position in which they serve. Bluetooth 7, failure to return, serve as the pivot. Because you're clarifying that they are the pivot. Bluetooth 3, star pass violation, serve as the jammer. It helps resolve a great deal of confusion. You've communicated to the person how they're going to serve. The penalty tracker may hear you over there. They can help make sure that the person's serving in the correct position when they get to the box. The jammer referee may hear this if it was a different referee who made the call, or if the jammer referee, if they're the one that made the call, the other nearby referees hear them. It helps communicate to everyone who in fact is holding a given position. So communicating that is very useful. Now, jammer referees, always keep your eye on the jammer, not the helmet cover. Even if a star pass goes wrong and the helmet cover goes on the floor, you don't stand there staring at the helmet cover. You know who the jammer is, and you stare at that jammer. The jammer is your job. You watch the jammer. You do not watch the helmet cover. You do not watch the pivot chasing off. I'm going to tell you about an experience in which I absolutely humiliated myself. And I don't like to tell this story because it's very embarrassing. I was at a game, and I was trying to be very helpful over there. It was like, Bluetooth 7, star pass violation. I turn, so-and-so, you are the pivot. You are not the jammer. I turn back, and I discovered, oh, crap. My jammer has not gone to the box, and I no longer remember who the jammer was. The jammer thinks they're blocker, and they're continuing to play. And I don't remember who it was. I took my best guess, and I got it wrong. So I reassessed the star pass violation, this time on a blocker who goes to the box, and they try to sit down. The person's telling them to sit down as jammer. They're saying, I'm a blocker. The box is now in an absolutely impossible situation. Tells them, doesn't matter. You serve as the jammer. And I'm sitting there going, oh, my day is going to hell now. And it's all my fault for taking my eyes off the jammer and forgetting who the jammer was. So fortunately, the jam ended before too long, and I had to tell the head referee that I completely fucked up. And yes, I apologize for screwing up your jam. Because again, this can cause a massive cascading series of errors over there. And I certainly caused one over there, and my crew was not pleased with me. So there are a few things you can do to prevent this. Number one, jam referees, you keep your eye on that jammer. Do not remove your eye from that jammer. That is an incredibly bad idea. Number two, as soon as the star comes off over there, like that, anytime the star, even if they're not passing it, a lot of leagues, including some of my own, train. As soon as you're not lead during the initial trip, you take the star off your head. Because that makes it easier for you to do star pass if you choose to, but you take the star off your head. So as soon as that star's off the head, I will say to the referees around me, I'll say, stars removed, Bluetooth 3 is the jammer, or, Bluetooth 3 has the star. I'm reassessing, the communication around me to who is the jammer, who's got the star. I'm not talking to the players. I'm talking to the head referee, maybe who's next to me, or I'm talking to the other jammer referee. Sometimes I am the head referee. I'm talking to the jammer referees, like, stars removed, Bluetooth 3 is the jammer, or Bluetooth 3 is the star. I'm trying to communicate this around me. Also, by saying that number, it puts it into your short-term memory. So had I said that person, well, of course I just called that jammer on a penalty, but sometimes saying the number out loud helps. So then you turn back, and you've still got the number in your short-term memory, and you can get this. I was very grateful. I figured my karma balanced out, because in another game, we had a similar-ish incident over there with a star pass, an illegal star pass, but it had to do with the what was this? Oh, it was an incomplete star pass because the person had committed the jammer had committed a forearm penalty, but before they were called on that penalty, they did the star pass. So the pivot legitimately thought they were the jammer because we had not finished issuing the forearm penalty to the initial jammer. And so the initial jammer, goes to the box, and, we got to get the pivot back on, and the poor jammer referee and all of this, at one point, she eventually comes back to the track. I don't even know where she'd been, but she comes back, and she shrieks, I don't know who my jammer is or where she is, and I was able to instantly say, oh, Bluetooth 3 is your jammer, she's right there, or whatever the number was. So I was able to instantly communicate it as head referee and solve it, and boy, I felt good, problem solved. So again, star is removed, blue 2-3 has the star. Always very helpful. Or sometimes I'll be like, star pass, blue 7-1 has the star. Over there. Just, again, reassessing this out loud, helping to communicate. And by the way, another reason for verbally communicating this is, as any Java referee will know you, skaters somehow become incredibly skilled at sleight of hand when they want to do a star pass. There are times the jammer and the pivot are not anywhere near each other, and yet suddenly you see the pivot racing away, holding the star, and they didn't throw it, but somehow they got close enough and you just missed it. It just happens sometimes. You miss the star pass. So by saying blue 2-3 has the star, that allows the jammer to go, that's not who I'm on, and boom, or the jammer referee to immediately switch and start chasing the correct person. So announcing who's the star is a great way to do communication. But yes, as I said, IPRs and OPRs, you are in charge of solving all the cascading, or solving the confusion around star passes that have gone awry, and making sure that everything is being communicated, the correct people are serving penalties in the correct positions, and that the correct people know what position they're serving in, and communicating to the crew at large what's going on, with the star pass and the aftermath. Jammer referees, you don't have to solve all that. You keep your eyes on the jammer over there, because if you take your eye off the jammer and try to help in the process, you risk causing your own series of errors, just like I did in a game. So, learn from my mistake, and don't do that. Anyway, this concludes Lesson 28, Passing the Star. And we will be back in... I don't even know where my list of lessons went. Well, we'll be back in Lesson 20... here we go. Lesson 29 is... yes, Junior Derby. Gameplay. Time for us to learn about another style of derby out there. So, we'll talk about that in our next lesson. Thanks.